Marcus Thompson pulled his black Ford F-150 into the dimly lit parking garage beneath the downtown shopping center. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows between the concrete pillars. It was 9:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and most of the spaces were empty except for a few scattered vehicles belonging to late-shift workers and security guards. The 34-year-old veteran had just finished dinner at his favorite steakhouse, celebrating a job interview that had gone better than expected. After 8 years in the Marines, including 3 deployments with force reconnaissance, Marcus was finally ready to transition into civilian security consulting. The interview had been for a position with a major corporation, and the hiring manager seemed impressed with his military background and specialized training. As Marcus gathered his leather jacket from the passenger seat, he remained alert out of habit. Years of operating in hostile territory had taught him to constantly scan his environment, even in seemingly safe locations. The parking garage felt too quiet, too isolated. His trained eyes picked up the subtle signs that something wasn't right. A van parked in an odd position near the exit ramp, its engine running despite no driver visible inside. 3 levels above street level, the garage offered multiple escape routes but also multiple blind spots where threats could hide. Marcus had chosen this particular spot because it was well lit and close to the stairwell. But now he noticed how the surrounding pillars created perfect concealment for anyone wanting to remain unseen. The security cameras he spotted were older models, their positioning suggesting they might have blind spots that experienced criminals would know how to exploit. As he stepped out of his truck and locked the doors, Marcus heard the subtle sound of footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The acoustics of the garage made it difficult to pinpoint exactly where the sounds were coming from, but his military training had taught him to trust his instincts. Something was definitely off about this situation. The footsteps seemed to be moving in a coordinated pattern, suggesting multiple individuals rather than just one person walking to their car. Marcus pretended to check his phone while actually using its black screen as a makeshift mirror to observe the area behind him. He could make out at least 2 figures moving between the parked cars, trying to stay in the shadows. His hand instinctively moved toward his concealed carry position, where his Glock 19 rested in its holster. Marcus had a permit to carry, and his military background meant he was more than qualified to handle firearms in high-stress situations. However, he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Sometimes the best tactical decision was to avoid confrontation entirely. The veteran's mind quickly assessed his options. He could return to his truck and drive away, but that would mean turning his back on potential threats and getting into a confined space where he'd be vulnerable. He could head toward the stairwell, but that would take him further from his vehicle and into an area where he could be cornered. The elevator was out of the question, too slow and too easy to trap someone inside. Marcus decided to continue walking toward the stairwell while maintaining situational awareness. If these were just random people heading to their cars, they would continue on their own paths. If they were following him with malicious intent, he would know soon enough. His breathing remained steady and controlled, just as he'd been trained during countless high-stress operations overseas. The sound of the running van's engine grew more noticeable as he moved away from his parking spot. Through his peripheral vision, Marcus could see that the vehicle's headlights were off despite the engine running. This was another red flag that confirmed his suspicions about the developing situation. As he approached the stairwell door, Marcus heard the footsteps behind him quicken slightly. The individuals were definitely following him now, and they were getting bolder about closing the distance. He estimated there were at least 3 people based on the pattern of sounds he was hearing. The fact that they were working together suggested this wasn't a random mugging, it was a coordinated operation. Marcus reached the stairwell door and paused, pretending to fumble for his keys while actually preparing for what he knew was about to happen. His years of training had taught him that the moments before contact were crucial for setting up tactical advantage. He needed to choose the right time and place to make his move, assuming a confrontation became inevitable. The parking garage fell silent except for the distant hum of the van's engine and the barely audible whisper of footsteps on concrete. Marcus could feel the tension building as his stalkers positioned themselves for whatever they had planned. He took a deep breath and prepared himself mentally for the confrontation that was about to unfold, drawing on years of combat experience that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations than this. The first voice Marcus heard came from directly behind him, rough and commanding with the kind of false bravado that marked inexperienced criminals trying to sound tougher than they actually were. "Hey man, hold up a second. We need to talk to you about something." Marcus slowly turned around, keeping his hands visible but ready to move. 3 men stood about 15 feet away, spread out in a loose triangle formation that suggested they had done this before. The leader was a stocky man in his late 20s wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets in a way that suggested he was gripping something. To his left stood a taller, thinner accomplice with nervous energy, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot. The third man had positioned himself slightly behind and to the right, clearly trying to flank Marcus and cut off any escape route back toward the parked cars. "What can I help you with?" Marcus replied calmly, his voice steady and controlled. Years of dealing with hostile interrogations and tense negotiations in combat zones had taught him the importance of remaining composed under pressure. He used the time to continue his tactical assessment of the situation, noting each man's positioning, probable weapons, and potential weaknesses. The leader took a step closer, his confidence growing as he mistook Marcus's calm demeanor for compliance or fear. "See, here's the thing. We're having some transportation issues tonight, and your truck looks like it might solve our problem. We're going to need your keys, your wallet, and that nice watch you're wearing." Marcus noticed that the man's voice carried the slight tremor of someone who was nervous despite trying to project authority. This suggested they weren't seasoned professionals, which could work either for or against him depending on how unpredictable their reactions might be. Amateur criminals were often more dangerous because they were more likely to panic and make poor decisions. "That's not going to happen," Marcus replied evenly, his tone conversational but firm. He shifted his stance slightly, moving into a more balanced position that would allow him to react quickly in any direction. The movement was subtle enough that the 3 men probably didn't recognize it as a tactical adjustment, but it gave him a significant advantage for what was about to unfold. The nervous accomplice on the left pulled out a knife, a cheap switchblade that clicked open with a metallic snap that echoed off the concrete walls. "Maybe you didn't hear him right the first time," he said, waving the blade in what he probably thought was a threatening manner. "We ain't asking, we're telling. Hand over your stuff or things are going to get real ugly real fast." Marcus studied the knife-wielding man's grip and stance, immediately recognizing several critical flaws in his technique. The way he held the weapon suggested he had never received proper training in knife combat, and his positioning left him vulnerable to disarmament. More importantly, the fact that he was waving the knife around indicated he was using it primarily as an intimidation tool rather than preparing for actual combat. The third man, who had been trying to work his way around to Marcus's flank, spoke up for the first time. "Come on, man, just make this easy on everybody. Give us what we want and you can walk away from this without getting hurt. We don't want to have to mess you up, but we will if you force us to." Marcus could hear the uncertainty in the man's voice, suggesting that violence wasn't his preferred option. This gave him valuable intelligence about the group's dynamics and willingness to escalate the situation. However, he also noticed that all 3 men were now positioned in ways that would make it difficult for him to retreat, without turning his back on at least one of them. "I understand you think you have me at a disadvantage," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm and measured. "But I need you to understand something too. I'm not just some random guy you picked out in a parking garage. I'm a United States Marine, and I've been in situations a lot worse than this one." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that betrayed his nervousness despite his attempt to seem amused. "Oh great, we got ourselves a tough guy here. You think that military stuff is going to help you against 3 guys and a knife? This ain't Afghanistan, soldier boy. This is the real world and you're outnumbered." What the 3 criminals didn't realize was that Marcus was mentally cataloging every detail of their positioning, weapons, and behavior patterns. His force recon training had included extensive instruction in close-quarters combat, weapons disarmament, and tactical psychology. He could see at least 4 different ways to neutralize the immediate threat, and several additional options for dealing with whatever backup might be waiting in that running van. The man with the knife took another step forward, apparently emboldened by his leader's words. "You got about 10 seconds to make up your mind before we make it up for you," he said, pointing the blade toward Marcus's chest. "Keys, wallet, watch, phone, everything, right now." Marcus could see the exact moment when the situation would escalate beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The 3 men were working themselves up mentally, feeding off each other's false confidence and pushing toward a level of aggression that would force them to follow through on their threats. In his experience, this was often the most dangerous moment in any confrontation, the point where amateur criminals convinced themselves they had no choice but to resort to violence. The parking garage seemed to grow even quieter as tension filled the air between the four men. Marcus knew that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended with 3 arrests or 3 trips to the emergency room. His training had taught him to always prefer the first option, but he was prepared for either outcome. "Last chance," the leader said, reaching into his pocket and revealing the grip of what appeared to be a small pistol. "Don't make us do this the hard way." Marcus saw the gun emerge from the leader's pocket and instantly shifted into combat mode. 8 years of military training, including specialized force reconnaissance operations, had conditioned him to react to lethal threats with lightning speed and overwhelming force. The 3 criminals had just escalated the situation from robbery to attempted murder, which meant all rules of engagement had changed. "You're making a serious mistake," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a cold, professional tone that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had served in special operations. The casual conversational demeanor was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a warrior who had faced life-and-death situations dozens of times before. The leader misinterpreted Marcus's warning as fear and pulled the gun completely free from his pocket. It was a small-caliber revolver, probably stolen, with scratches and wear marks that suggested it had been passed around among criminals for years. The man's grip was awkward and uncertain, indicating he had limited experience actually firing the weapon. "Now you're getting the picture," the leader said, trying to sound confident despite the slight tremor in his hand. "This ain't some game anymore. You're gonna give us everything you got, or you're gonna end up bleeding out on this concrete floor." What happened next unfolded so quickly that the 3 criminals barely had time to process what they were seeing. Marcus had been trained in advanced close-quarters combat by some of the most elite instructors in the military. His reflexes had been honed through countless hours of practice and real-world application in combat zones, where hesitation meant death. Marcus stepped forward and to the right in one fluid motion, moving inside the gun's effective range while simultaneously reaching for the weapon. His left hand clamped down on the leader's wrist like a steel trap, controlling the gun's direction while his right hand struck the man's throat with precise force. The combination of movements was so fast and coordinated that the gun was pointing harmlessly toward the ceiling before its owner even realized he was being disarmed. The leader made a choking sound and stumbled backward, completely overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of what he thought was a controlled situation. Marcus twisted the man's wrist with clinical precision, applying pressure to specific nerve points that forced the fingers to open involuntarily. The revolver clattered to the concrete floor, spinning away from all 4 men. The knife-wielding accomplice reacted with panicked aggression, plunging forward with his switchblade extended toward Marcus's midsection. This was exactly the kind of desperate, poorly planned attack that Marcus had trained to counter hundreds of times. He sidestepped the clumsy thrust while grabbing the attacker's wrist, then used the man's own momentum to send him crashing into a concrete pillar face first. The impact made a sickening sound that echoed through the parking garage, and the knife flew from the man's hand as he collapsed to the ground with blood streaming from his broken nose. He would live, but he would definitely need medical attention and would probably think twice before threatening anyone with a blade ever again. The 3rd criminal, who had been trying to flank Marcus from the beginning, suddenly realized that his 2 partners were down and that he was facing someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. He turned to run, but Marcus was already moving. Years of pursuing insurgents through difficult terrain had made him incredibly fast over short distances. Marcus caught the fleeing man after only a few steps and took him down with a textbook tackle that sent both of them sliding across the smooth concrete floor. The criminal tried to fight back, throwing wild punches that Marcus easily avoided while applying a rear-naked choke that cut off blood flow to the brain. Within seconds, the man went limp and unconscious. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds from the moment the gun appeared to the moment all 3 criminals were neutralized. Marcus stood up slowly, his breathing only slightly elevated despite the intense physical activity. He looked around the parking garage to make sure there were no additional threats before checking on his attackers. The leader was sitting against a pillar, holding his throat and gasping for air. His eyes were wide with shock and fear as he stared at Marcus with a new understanding of just how badly they had miscalculated their target. The man with the knife was conscious but groaning in pain, blood still flowing from his obviously broken nose. The third attacker was beginning to stir as consciousness returned. Marcus retrieved the dropped revolver and quickly checked it for ammunition and safety concerns. The weapon was loaded with cheap, corroded bullets that probably would have misfired anyway. He engaged the safety and tucked the gun into his waistband, well away from any of the three criminals who were slowly coming to terms with their new reality. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice returning to a conversational tone despite the circumstances. "You're going to sit exactly where you are until the police arrive. You're not going to move, you're not going to talk, and you're definitely not going to try anything else stupid." The leader tried to speak but could only produce a croaking sound due to the damage to his throat. Marcus had struck with precise force, enough to neutralize the threat and cause temporary disability, but not enough to cause permanent injury. It was the kind of controlled application of violence that separated professional warriors from street thugs. "I know you're probably wondering how that went so wrong so fast," Marcus continued, keeping watch for any additional threats while monitoring his three prisoners. "The answer is that you picked the wrong target. I'm Force Reconnaissance, United States Marine Corps. We're trained to operate behind enemy lines, eliminate high-value targets, and survive in situations where most people would die." The parking garage fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of the van's engine. Marcus realized that whoever was driving the getaway vehicle had probably witnessed at least part of the confrontation and was likely trying to decide whether to flee or come help their partners. He prepared himself for the possibility of additional threats while keeping his three prisoners under control. The sound of screeching tires echoed through the parking garage as the van that had been idling near the exit suddenly roared to life and began speeding toward Marcus and the three subdued criminals. Through the vehicle's windshield, Marcus could see two additional figures, confirming that this had been a five-person operation with a driver and another accomplice serving as backup. Marcus immediately began calculating angles and distances as the van approached. The vehicle was moving fast but awkwardly, suggesting the driver was panicking rather than executing a well-planned rescue attempt. The parking garage's layout worked in Marcus's favor. The concrete pillars and parked cars created obstacles that would limit the van's maneuverability and force it to slow down at certain points. "Stay down and don't move," Marcus commanded the three men on the ground, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-threatening situations. He moved quickly to position himself behind a concrete pillar that would provide cover while still allowing him to observe the approaching vehicle. The van's driver clearly had limited experience with tactical driving. Instead of using the vehicle as a precision weapon, he was simply trying to get close enough for his passenger to provide assistance. This gave Marcus several opportunities to gain the upper hand, but he needed to act fast before the situation spiraled further out of control. As the van rounded a parked SUV and entered the open area where the confrontation had taken place, Marcus could see that the passenger was holding what appeared to be a baseball bat. The man was already opening his door, preparing to jump out while the vehicle was still moving. This was another tactical error that demonstrated their lack of professional training. Marcus waited until the van was committed to its approach vector, then stepped out from behind the pillar with the confiscated revolver drawn and trained on the driver. His military training had taught him the importance of clear, direct communication in high-stress situations, especially when dealing with individuals who might not understand the gravity of their circumstances. "Stop the vehicle immediately and put your hands where I can see them," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the engine. "I am armed, I am trained, and I will defend myself if you continue this assault." The driver's eyes went wide when he saw the gun pointed directly at him through the windshield. He hit the brakes so hard that the van skidded sideways on the smooth concrete floor, and his passenger was thrown against the dashboard before he could exit the vehicle. The smell of burning rubber filled the air as the van came to a stop about 20 feet away from Marcus's position. For several tense seconds, nobody moved. The driver sat frozen behind the wheel, his hands visible on the steering wheel, while his passenger slowly sat up and stared at Marcus with growing recognition of how badly their rescue attempt had failed. The three original attackers remained on the ground where Marcus had left them, none of them willing to risk further injury by trying to escape. "Driver, turn off the engine and throw the keys out the window," Marcus commanded, maintaining his firing stance while scanning for any additional threats. "Passenger, keep your hands visible and do not reach for anything. Both of you need to understand that this situation is completely under my control." The driver complied immediately, tossing the keys through his open window where they landed with a metallic clink on the concrete floor. The van's engine died, leaving the parking garage unnaturally quiet except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus could see that both men in the van were young, probably in their early 20s, and clearly inexperienced in handling high-pressure situations. The passenger was still gripping his baseball bat, but his hands were shaking noticeably, and he seemed to be having second thoughts about his decision to get involved in what had started as a simple carjacking. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with calm authority. "Everyone is going to remain exactly where they are until law enforcement arrives. Anyone who tries to leave, tries to communicate with outside accomplices, or makes any threatening movements will be dealt with accordingly." The leader of the original group, who was still holding his injured throat, managed to croak out a few words. "You don't understand, man. This is bigger than just us. There are people who are going to be looking for us, and when they find out what happened here..." Marcus cut him off with a look that had intimidated hardened insurgents in combat zones around the world. "What I understand is that you made a series of very poor decisions tonight. You targeted someone you assumed was helpless. You escalated to deadly force. And now you're trying to threaten me with consequences from your criminal associates." The man in the van's passenger seat finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know, man. We thought you were just some regular guy leaving dinner. Nobody told us you were military." "That's the problem with your line of work," Marcus replied, still maintaining his defensive position and keeping watch for additional threats. "You never know who you're dealing with until it's too late. Today you learned that lesson the hard way." Marcus pulled out his cell phone with his free hand and quickly dialed 911, keeping the weapon trained on the van while he spoke to the emergency dispatcher. He provided his location, described the situation as an attempted armed robbery that had been neutralized, and requested both police and medical assistance for the injured criminals. The dispatcher asked if anyone needed immediate medical attention, and Marcus assessed his prisoners quickly. The man with the broken nose was still bleeding but appeared stable, and the leader's throat injury was painful but not life-threatening. The third original attacker was fully conscious now and seemed to be suffering from nothing more serious than bruised pride and some minor scrapes from his encounter with the concrete floor. "We have multiple suspects in custody with minor injuries," Marcus reported to the dispatcher. "No serious medical emergencies, but we'll need several units to transport 5 individuals. The situation is secure, but I am armed and will remain so until officers arrive on scene." As Marcus waited for law enforcement to arrive, he continued monitoring his 5 prisoners while mentally reviewing the sequence of events that had led to this outcome. In his military experience, successful operations always concluded with thorough after-action analysis to identify lessons learned and areas for improvement. The sound of police sirens grew louder as multiple units responded to Marcus's 911 call. Within minutes, the parking garage was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of 4 patrol cars and an ambulance. Marcus maintained his position and kept the confiscated weapon visible, but pointed safely toward the ground as uniformed officers entered the garage with their own firearms drawn. "Armed citizen with weapon," Marcus called out clearly, following protocols he had learned during military police training. "I am the person who called 911. I am holding 5 suspects who attempted an armed robbery. My weapon is currently pointed at the ground, and I will comply with all lawful orders from responding officers." The lead officer, a veteran sergeant with over 15 years of experience, immediately recognized Marcus's professional demeanor and tactical awareness. "Sir, I need you to slowly place your weapon on the ground and step back with your hands visible," the sergeant commanded, his own firearm trained on Marcus until the situation could be properly assessed. Marcus complied immediately, carefully placing the revolver on the concrete floor and stepping back several paces with his hands raised. "The weapon on the ground was taken from the primary suspect during the initial assault," he explained calmly. "I have a concealed carry permit for my personal firearm, which is currently holstered on my right hip. I am a United States Marine veteran with no criminal record. The sergeant approached cautiously while other officers moved to secure the 5 suspects, who had remained exactly where Marcus had positioned them throughout the wait for law enforcement. The lead criminal was still holding his throat and speaking in whispers, while the man with the broken nose was receiving attention from paramedics who had followed the police into the garage. "Can you walk me through what happened here?" the sergeant asked Marcus after confirming that the immediate scene was secure. Other officers were already beginning to take statements from the suspects, though most of them seemed reluctant to provide details about their failed operation. Marcus provided a clear, chronological account of the events, starting with his arrival in the parking garage and ending with the unsuccessful rescue attempt by the van crew. His military training had taught him the importance of accurate reporting, and he made sure to include only facts that he could personally verify rather than assumptions about the suspect's motivations or planning. These 5 individuals approached me in a coordinated manner, demanded my vehicle and personal property, and escalated to deadly force when I refused to comply, Marcus explained. I responded with appropriate defensive measures to neutralize the threat and protect my own life. No excessive force was used, and I provided medical assistance to injured suspects while waiting for your arrival. The sergeant nodded as he took notes, clearly impressed by Marcus's professional handling of both the confrontation and its aftermath. "We're going to need you to come to the station to provide a full written statement, but based on what I'm seeing here, this looks like a clear case of justified self-defense against multiple armed assailants." One of the other officers approached with information about the suspects that had been gathered from their identification and a quick database search. "Sarge, we've got quite a crew here. 3 of these guys have prior arrest for robbery and assault, and the driver has an outstanding warrant for possession with intent to distribute. The van is reported stolen from 2 counties over." Marcus wasn't surprised by this information. In his experience, criminals who attempted armed robberies in parking garages were usually repeat offenders who had graduated from smaller crimes to more serious felonies. The coordination and planning involved in tonight's operation suggested they had probably done this before, though clearly not against anyone with his particular skill set. The paramedics finished examining the suspect with the broken nose and reported that he would need treatment at the hospital but was in no immediate danger. The leader's throat injury was more concerning from a medical standpoint, but x-rays would be needed to determine if there was any serious damage to his larynx or windpipe. "The good news is that all your defensive actions appear to have been precisely calibrated," the lead paramedic told Marcus as he packed up his equipment. "You obviously knew exactly how much force to use to neutralize threats without causing permanent injury. That kind of restraint is pretty impressive under these circumstances." Marcus appreciated the professional recognition, but he knew that his response had been the result of extensive training rather than any special personal qualities. Force reconnaissance Marines were taught to use exactly the amount of force necessary to achieve their objectives, whether that meant silently eliminating a sentry or subduing suspects for interrogation. The sergeant returned with additional questions about Marcus's background and training, partly for the police report and partly out of professional curiosity. "Mind if I ask what your MOS was in the Marines?" he asked, using the military term for job classification. "Force reconnaissance," Marcus replied simply. 8 years active duty, 3 combat deployments, specialized training in direct action, deep reconnaissance, and maritime operations. "I separated 6 months ago and I'm currently transitioning to civilian security consulting." The sergeant whistled softly, clearly understanding the implications of that background. No wonder these guys didn't know what hit them. Force Recon doesn't mess around when it comes to close-quarters combat. As the suspects were loaded into patrol cars for transport to jail and the hospital, Marcus realized that word of tonight's incident would probably spread quickly through both law enforcement and criminal circles. In his experience, stories like this became legends that grew with each retelling, serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of making assumptions about potential victims. The detective who would be handling the case arrived just as the last of the suspects was being placed in a patrol car. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Martinez and explained that she would need to conduct a more detailed interview with Marcus at the police station, but assured him that everything appeared to support his account of justified self-defense. "Based on the evidence and witness statements, I don't anticipate any charges being filed against you," Detective Martinez explained. "However, we'll need your full cooperation with the investigation and you should be prepared for the possibility that defense attorneys might try to paint you as using excessive force during any eventual trial. Marcus nodded, understanding that legal proceedings were often more complicated than the actual events that triggered them. He had testified in military tribunals before, and knew the importance of sticking to facts and avoiding speculation about intentions or motivations that couldn't be proven. At the police station, Detective Martinez led Marcus through a comprehensive debriefing that lasted nearly 3 hours. The interview room was equipped with recording equipment that would preserve his testimony for future legal proceedings, and Marcus answered every question with the same precision and attention to detail that had characterized his military service. During the interview, Marcus learned that the 5 suspects were part of a larger criminal organization that had been operating in the area for several months. The stolen van was just one of several vehicles that had been used in similar carjacking attempts, and the group had successfully targeted at least 8 other victims before encountering Marcus in the parking garage. What makes your case different is that you were the first target who fought back effectively, Detective Martinez explained as she reviewed the case files. The other victims were mostly elderly individuals or people who appeared vulnerable for various reasons. Your attackers had gotten confident because their previous operations had gone smoothly. The detective showed Marcus photographs and descriptions of the other incidents, and he could see clear patterns in the group's methods and target selection. They preferred isolated locations like parking garages, shopping center lots late at night, and ATM locations where people might be carrying cash. The criminals had been careful to avoid areas with extensive security camera coverage and had typically chosen victims who seemed unlikely to resist. The leader, Daniel Kruger, has been on our radar for about 6 months, Detective Martinez continued. He's been recruiting younger criminals and organizing them into crews for increasingly ambitious operations. Tonight's incident was supposed to be a step up for this particular group, their first attempt at carjacking a late-model pickup truck. Marcus reviewed the criminal histories that the detective shared with him, noting the progression from petty theft and drug offenses to more serious crimes involving violence. In his military experience, this kind of escalation was common among enemy combatants who became emboldened by early successes and began taking greater risks. Stolen van had yielded significant evidence when it was processed by the crime scene unit. Hidden compartments contained stolen credit cards, identification documents, and jewelry that had been taken from previous victims. There were also burglary tools, additional weapons, and what appeared to be a detailed list of potential targets that included Marcus's name and vehicle description. It looks like they had been watching you for at least a week, Detective Martinez revealed, showing Marcus surveillance photos that had been found in the van. These pictures were taken at your apartment complex, the restaurant where you had dinner tonight, and several other locations. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. It was a planned operation. Marcus studied the photographs with growing concern, recognizing that the level of planning involved suggested a more sophisticated criminal organization than he had initially assumed. The fact that they had conducted surveillance and gathered intelligence on him personally indicated they might have connections to other criminal enterprises or even inside information from legitimate sources. The detective explained that the investigation had already expanded to include federal agencies, since the stolen vehicles and coordinated criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions suggested violations of interstate commerce laws. The FBI's Organized Crime Task Force was particularly interested in the intelligence gathering methods that the criminals had used to identify and track potential victims. We're hoping you might be willing to work with us on a larger investigation, Detective Martinez said carefully. Your military background and the way you handled tonight's situation suggest you might be valuable in helping us understand their operational methods and identify other members of this organization. Marcus considered the request seriously, knowing that his force reconnaissance training had given him insights into tactics and procedures that might not be obvious to civilian law enforcement officers. He also recognized that his successful defense against the carjacking attempt had probably disrupted a significant criminal operation and might have prevented future attacks on innocent victims. The detective showed him additional evidence that had been recovered from the suspect's personal belongings, including cell phones that contained communications with other criminal associates. The text messages and call logs revealed a network of individuals involved in various illegal activities, from drug distribution to identity theft to organized retail fraud. What we're seeing is a pattern of escalating criminal activity that suggests these individuals were being directed by someone with more experience and resources, Detective Martinez explained. Tonight's operation was supposed to be a test run for something bigger, and we need to identify the people at the top of this organization. Marcus agreed to cooperate with the expanded investigation, understanding that his military oath to protect American citizens didn't end with his separation from active duty. He provided detailed analysis of the tactical methods he had observed, the coordination between the suspects, and the intelligence-gathering techniques they had apparently used to plan their operation. The interview concluded with Detective Martinez explaining the legal process that would follow. The 5 suspects would be charged with multiple felonies, including attempted armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy to commit robbery. Additional charges might be added as the investigation uncovered more evidence of their criminal activities. You should know that this incident is probably going to generate significant media attention, the detective warned Marcus as they concluded the interview. A military veteran successfully defending himself against 5 armed criminals is exactly the kind of story that news outlets love to cover. Marcus wasn't particularly interested in publicity, but he understood that media coverage might serve a useful purpose in deterring other criminals from attempting similar operations. In his experience, psychological warfare was often more effective than direct confrontation in preventing future conflicts. As he prepared to leave the police station, Marcus reflected on how different his life might have been if he hadn't received military training. The average citizen faced with 5 armed criminals would have had very few options, other than compliance or hoping that law enforcement arrived quickly enough to prevent serious injury or death. The detective provided Marcus with contact information for victim services and explained that counseling resources were available if he experienced any psychological effects from the confrontation. She also gave him a case number and timeline for when he might be needed to testify if the case went to trial. 6 months after the parking garage incident, Marcus sat in a federal courthouse listening as the judge pronounced sentences for the 5 men who had attempted to carjack him. The investigation that had begun with their failed robbery attempt had uncovered a criminal network involving more than 20 individuals across 3 states, leading to one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's recent history. Daniel Kruger, the leader of the group, received 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges including racketeering, conspiracy to commit robbery, and weapons violations. The sentences for his accomplices ranged from 8 to 12 years, depending on their criminal histories and level of cooperation with law enforcement. The man whose nose Marcus had broken had provided crucial testimony that helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the criminal organization. Detective Martinez, who had become a friend during the lengthy investigation, approached Marcus outside the courthouse after the sentencing hearing. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did to help us build this case," she said, shaking his hand warmly. "Without your cooperation and expertise, we never would have been able to roll up the entire network." The federal prosecutor had explained during the trial that Marcus's successful defense had prevented the criminal group from graduating to more serious offenses. Phone records and recovered documents indicated they had been planning to target armored car deliveries and bank employees, operations that would have put many more innocent people at risk. Marcus's testimony during the trial had been particularly effective because of his ability to explain tactical concepts to the jury in clear, understandable terms. His military background had given him credibility with both the judge and the jurors, who clearly respected his service and his restrained use of force during the confrontation. The media attention that Detective Martinez had predicted had indeed materialized, but Marcus had been careful to use it constructively. Several news interviews had focused on the importance of situational awareness and personal safety, and he had been invited to speak at law enforcement training, sessions about civilian response to criminal threats, the security consulting business that Marcus had been trying to establish when the incident occurred had grown significantly as a result of the publicity. Corporate clients were impressed by his real-world demonstration of tactical skills, and several government agencies had contracted his services for training programs and security assessments. More importantly, Marcus had been contacted by other military veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. His example of using military skills constructively in a civilian context had inspired several former service members to pursue careers in security, law enforcement, and emergency services. The company where Marcus had interviewed the night of the attempted carjacking had not only offered him the position, but had created an entirely new department focused on executive protection and corporate security. His role as director of the new division allowed him to hire several other military veterans and create a bridge between military service and civilian careers. Marcus had also become involved with a nonprofit organization that provided self-defense training to vulnerable populations, including elderly individuals and people with disabilities. The classes focused on awareness and avoidance rather than physical confrontation, but participants learned valuable skills for recognizing and responding to potential threats. The parking garage where the incident had occurred had installed additional security cameras and improved lighting as a direct result of Marcus's experience. The shopping center management had also hired off-duty police officers to patrol the area during evening hours, making it safer for other customers who might be targeted by criminals. One of the most satisfying outcomes for Marcus was learning that several of the criminals' previous victims had recovered stolen property that was discovered during the investigation. The elderly woman who had been robbed 2 weeks before Marcus's incident had been particularly grateful to get back her late husband's wedding ring, which had been found hidden in the stolen van. Detective Martinez had kept Marcus informed about the other cases that had been solved as a result of evidence recovered from the criminal network. The investigation had led to the resolution of more than 30 unsolved crimes, providing closure for victims and their families who had given up hope of ever seeing justice. As Marcus drove home from the courthouse, he reflected on how a single moment of violence had led to so many positive outcomes. His military training had prepared him to defend himself, but the real victory had been the disruption of a criminal organization that had been terrorizing innocent people for months. The job interview that had started the chain of events now seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 6 months. Marcus's new career was more challenging and rewarding than anything he had imagined during his transition from military service, and he was already planning expansion into new areas of security consulting. His experience had also reinforced his appreciation for the training and discipline that the Marine Corps had instilled in him. Without that background, the confrontation in the parking garage could have ended very differently, not just for him but for all the future victims who might have suffered at the hands of the criminal organization. Marcus pulled into his apartment complex and noticed the security improvements that had been implemented there as well. Better lighting, emergency call boxes, and regular security patrols had made the entire neighborhood safer for all residents. The ripple effects of one successful act of self-defense had spread far beyond that single night in a downtown parking garage. As he walked to his door, Marcus smiled at the irony that what had started as an attempt to victimize him had actually opened doors to opportunities he never could have imagined. Sometimes the best way to defeat predators was simply to prove that not everyone was prey, and that some people were prepared to fight back when cornered. The Carjackers had learned that lesson the hard way, but at least they had learned it before someone got killed.